Sarah, hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. Yeah, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. It's really good to see you.
And you?
Would you mind introducing yourself and giving us an overview of your work, please?
Sure. I'm Sarah Grange. I go by other names. Uh, what am I? It's always a really tricky question for me because the answer changes depending on sort of what day it is and what I'm up to. Broadly speaking, I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I mostly work in theatre, but there's kind of text-based work and kind of whatever's flirting with me, really. So I've like dabbled in sound art and other things like that. And I'm currently also a PhD candidate. I think that's the way to put it. I'm in the middle of a research project that is a kind of mix of history and queer theory and performance theatre making, improvisatory practice stuff.
Great, thank you. We're going to need to hear more about all of those things.
Sure.
Perhaps we could hear more about the last thing that you mentioned then. What does it mean to work between history, queer theory, and performance? And perhaps we could also unpack what you mean by queer theory as well for anyone who's not familiar with
Yeah.
that term.
I'll do my best. I mean, I think the thing about queer theory is that it's kind of willfully a bit vague and hard to define. There's quite a lot of different queer theorists and it covers lots of different areas. So the main people that I've been reading and kind of thinking through their work are Jack Halberstam and Elizabeth Freeman. And their work is kind of around trying to think about different ways of doing history, I guess, that has space and respect for queer lives. And the fact that I think a lot of queer lives in the past have been kind of erased from history or not kind of treated with a lot of respect, and that those queer people in the past haven't really been able to sort of their experience, their kind of first person narrative isn't necessarily the thing that gets recorded. So it's kind of how to meet those people who kind of lie outside of the cis-het white male trajectory of kind of progressive history. So not the dudes on horses on the battlefields, but kind of what's happening for the people whose lives don't fit into those structures and those power structures and who aren't kind of recognized, I guess, by their society.
Yeah. And this is returning us to an issue which has come up across our videos, and Sydney Wagner's video most recently, thinking about the absence of Romany lives in the archive and what you do when you don't have, as you've just put it, that first person narrative. And I guess the problem is not just dudes on horses, but dudes on horses with quills writing things down about other dudes on horses.
Yeah, all of
I like
that.
it as a visual image, but raises all kinds of historical issues about non-dudes on not on non-horses. Oh dear, there's too many negatives going on there. But how we reach other kinds of lives. Can you tell us a bit about the specific queer life or lives that you are after in the current project?
Yeah, sure. So I'm excuse me, I'm fine. I went for a run and I was getting a bit of a cough after that, so there we go. Yeah, I'm really specifically working with someone called Mary Fritz, who was also called Mole Frith and Mole Cutpurse and various other names during their life. So Mary or Mole was a cross-dressing performer and criminal, and fence of stolen goods and various other slightly nefarious and scandalous jobs. She was born in the mid 1580s and she died in 1659. So she had quite a wild ride through London across several monarchs and the Civil War and the Interregnum. So yeah, she's kind of, if you've heard of her, it's probably because Middleton and Dekker wrote a play called The Roaring Girl about her. And she pops up in a few other kind of texts and things from the 17th century. So she was quite an infamous character at the time.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that surprised me when you and I first started speaking about Frith is just how long that life is. That 1580, precisely because of, as you've just said, the pull of the Roaring Girl, which is 1610, 11, I think. I think of Frith as a Jacobean life, but of course, 1580s to the the mid Elizabethan period, all the way through to nearly the Restoration, is an extraordinary life to be living.
Yeah, and to live that whole life in a very kind of renegade fashion as well, to the regimes that she survived whilst maintaining the kind of, I guess, integrity about who she wanted to be and how she wanted to present to the world.
Yeah. And where do you sit? You and I have talked before about pronoun choices around Frith. Where do you sit with that now for someone who is potentially living between gender binaries and refusing those binaries? Is this someone that you read of as a female life, as a trans life, somewhere in between? Where are you at with that?
Well, I guess so. A big part of the research is trying not to get definitive about it. So for me, it's just a thing that I play with quite a lot. So I mostly use she and they. I sometimes use he. I guess what I'm trying to get at is some understanding. The research is an attempt to have a conversation with Mary Frith, basically, which I think we'll probably talk about a bit more in a moment. But part of that conversation is trying to sort of sense how she might have understood herself at the time. And obviously we've got a whole load of language and categories and a kind of taxonomy of gender that wasn't how folks thought about themselves back in the 17th century. So it's kind of trying to like have a very flexible understanding of that and play with that and see what difference it makes actually in how I think about this person and what gender I'm using about them at any time, but that I wouldn't ever sort of put my flag in one particular identity and say yes, they were definitely a trans man or whatever, because I think that doesn't feel appropriate or ethical, really. And I think the other thing that's interesting for me in this project is that there's a certain amount of like mapping my life and Mary's life kind of on top of each other, and like finding where we intersect, like what are our shared spaces and what are our shared territories, and how can we share kind of sensory experiences and materials and stuff. And I think because I use she or they pronouns, and that's a kind of my conversation with myself around gender is kind of an ongoing thing. So I find it interesting to kind of reflect through Mary kind of on myself and vice versa as well. So the whole thing maintains a kind of playfulness.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really helpful answer. Sarah, if it's all right to ask one more question about Frith, just so I feel so we've kind of rooted her or them for our listeners. And then we'll move on to your practice as a performer researching Frith, if that's all right. But could you root Frith's life in, well, to go back to our starting point here, in its queerness? What are the things which mark Frith as queer then or now?
So the main thing is dress. So Mary Frith dressed in men's apparel is kind of how it generally gets recorded, is for most of her adult life, as far as we can tell. So that was one of the things that got her kind of her notoriety earlier in her life, was dressing in men's apparel, but also doing men's activities. So which I mean mostly being drunk in taverns and performing. So there's a point where she gets in trouble with the church courts, the consistory court, and there's one of the little fragments of her in the archive is this moment where she's hauled in front of the bishop, I think, and the things she's accused of are that she's basically behaving like a man. So she's wearing men's clothes, she's going drinking in taverns, she's hanging out with gamblers and all sorts of dodgy folks, and starting fights and having brawls, and swearing is a very big thing in that consistory court thing that she's been I think it's something like tearing God out of his kingdom or something. So she's using aggressive language, aggressive behavior, she's taking up space, she's being very present, and she's doing that in men's apparel. So the point where she gets the other thing in that consistory court testimony is the moment where she's performed on stage at the Fortune Theatre in men's apparel, and sort of said some lewd stuff about if anyone doubts that she's a woman, if they come to her chambers, she can prove that it's true. So she's not, unlike most of the other women who turn up in the archive dressing in men's apparel, she's not doing it to be in disguise. She's not doing it to sneak into bed with her boyfriend. She's not doing it to sneak into a man's trade or the military. She's very loudly proclaiming her body to be female, but her clothing to be male, and doing that as a real challenge to authority. And that's kind of the root of, and then there's a lot of debate at the time about what does that mean. Does that mean that she's a hermaphrodite, to use the phrase that they used at the time? The way that they read clothing as being quite a literal representation of the body underneath the clothing in a way that I think we don't. So yeah.
But,
I rambled off on one there. I don't know if that answered the question.
Brilliant, thank you. And to put that into modern language, is this someone who's not invested in passing, but is invested in situating themselves at what feels to the culture around them as a problematic boundary, and saying, here's where I am, and very, very deliberately fixing themselves in different kind of places on a gender binary at particular moments? For example, offering to display their female body in private. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. They're doing it to make trouble, which I find really exciting.
Yeah.
I think it's the inherited ideas of what women, again I'm going to do air quotes for women, were expected to be doing, or how they're expected to be behaving at the time. I think we've inherited this idea that there's quite a passive submissive role, and I think that Mary Frith is one example of people really kicking against that, and there are more examples of that, but she's kind of the loudest and proudest.
Great, thank you. You mentioned at the start about the overlaps between what Frith is up to and what you feel you might be up to. So I don't know if you would describe yourself as doing it to make trouble, but could you tell us more about what it is you're doing with this project and how you are coming at this research task as a performer?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess there definitely is an element of it that is about a little bit making trouble. There's definitely a kind of trickster quality to it. I suppose because I'm coming at historical archives as an artist, as a theatre maker, so I find that I give myself, because of that, a certain permission or a certain leeway in how I'm dealing with the archive. So I've been listening to I was listening to Hilary Mantel's Wreath lectures actually last week, and she says some really lovely useful stuff in there about her experience coming at the historical archive as a novelist, and I think there's a lot of parallels. So she says, I had to write it down because it's so great. She said, history is not the past, it is the method we have evolved of organising our ignorance of the past. And that feels really appropriate, I think, to the work that I've been trying to do. So and how does that manifest in a kind of trickstery way, I guess, would be that there's a real engagement with emotional responses, but also kind of an esoteric approach to it. So there's some elements of the way that I'm working with the archive might feel a little bit like maybe a seance, or kind of magic, I guess. You know, so at the moment I've got to this point, just to give an example, where there's never been a birthday for Mary Frith, and I was having a little look on one of those genealogy sites where I think must have fairly recently, because it's not the first time I've looked, uploaded a whole load of London parish registers from the time. So I've now found 3 potential Mary Friths, 2 of which kind of agree with the different theories about when she might have been born, and one that's a total wild card. And so I've given those dates to a friend of mine who's an astrologer who does star charts, and she's going to have a look at the star charts for those 3 Mary Friths, and we'll see which one, according to the stars, seems to agree most with the personality of Mary Frith that we've kind of got, that we're recovering from the archive. and that sounds a bit flippant and a bit funny, but there's actually, I think, because if you think about how an early modern person understood themselves, that astrology was quite a big thing for them, you know, that there were Dr. Dee and Simon Foreman and people like that who did a lot of work around kind of astrological understandings of stuff. So it's kind of going, well, it's not really about seeking the kind of factual truth of saying, you know, we've done lots and lots and lots of close research and we know that this is definitely the Mary Frith that became the Roaring Girl because of, you know, things in the historical archive, but saying like, how might an early modern person have got at that? Yeah. And yeah, so there's a certain permission to play with things that might not seem particularly kind of academic or proper, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you. We have some more content on Simon Foreman coming. I'm enjoying how prominent Simon Foreman is becoming in these YouTube videos. There's a conversation with Matt Stegel and David McInnes we're publishing in a few weeks, which also thinks about Simon Foreman. I also love the idea of Frith's birthday, and I wonder if during the lockdown, maybe we could start this thing, because we're all supposed to be singing happy birthday while we wash our hands. Maybe we could encourage everyone to sing happy birthday to Mel Frith every single day, and eventually we'll get it right, and there'll be a mass sing song for Frith.
Well, this is the week. I mean, I don't know when this video is going to go out, but we're recording this on the 14th of April, and the date that most closely agrees with what historians have kind of surmised before. One of the baptisms that I found was the 19th of April, so we know she was probably born sometime in the week before that.
Because get this video out pronto. Okay, great, that's fantastic.
This is very likely at least one of the three this is one of the three potential Mary Frith's birth week that we're in right now. So
amazing. Happy birthday. So playing with, I don't want to paraphrase you wrong, so just correct me if I get this wrong, but you were talking a minute ago about playing with things which academics would otherwise take much more seriously, and I guess a big strand of the work we've been doing with these videos is to think more about play and how useful and exciting play is for any researcher, not just a researcher who's interested in performance. But could you tell us a bit more about that and what it might look like, either in terms of when you're sat facing an historical document, or when you're thinking about putting a show on, which is engaging with such documents?
Yeah, sure. I guess it really kind of fundamentally it all comes down to thinking with the body. So whenever you've got any kind of text or literature, my question is, I mean, of course, looking at the words and what the meaning might be, but for me, there's always this whole other series of questions around the body that created that text, and all of the invisible bodies that supported that text creation to happen. So, and also all of the bodies that received that text. So, who's writing it and how are they writing it? What are they writing it on or with? Who are they writing it for? And those people that they're writing it for, how are they experiencing it? Are they watching other bodies perform it? Are they reading it to each other in their parlour? Are they sitting, you know, quietly with it on their own? And that kind of, I guess, matrix of kind of experiences around that, and all the bodies that are present in that. And I think especially when it's performance based, I think we have this idea, this sort of idea of like Shakespeare sitting at his desk on his own, like furiously scrawling away into the night, and this idea of this kind of single author, this genius, single genius, lone genius who creates this text, and then people kind of in some way consume that text, and as a theatre maker, that's just fundamentally that's just not how it happens. All theatre is a collaboration of some kind, right? So the text is only an element of that. And I think there's been some really interesting work, I think, was it Richard Priest, I'm not very good at names, sorry, about this idea that the texts, the way texts were performed even in the early modern period, even if they were written by a lone author or by a collaboration of authors, which were obviously very popular. There's lots of collaborations, Middleton and Dekker being just one. That each of those performances is kind of like a work in progress being shared, and the audience will co-author that work in some way. The audience response shapes the text. And I think especially so in the early modern period, when they weren't the audience that we've all been trained into being, of sitting very silently with deep respect, and getting very cross at the rustling of a cough sweet wrapper or someone's phone going off or whatever. And those early modern texts were all written for an audience that's very boisterous and loud and very present and very much part of the experience of that performance. So your co-audience members are as much part of the performance as the people on stage. And that's really interesting for me around the Roaring Girl and Amends for Ladies, which is the other show that Fritz turns up in, but also things like so one of the things that Mary Frith is kind of, I guess, accused of being is a cut purse. And I was reading somewhere that if pickpockets were discovered in the audience, quite often they'd be hauled up on stage and tied to a post on stage. So the pickpocket they become part of the company in the performance in a way. So that idea of whose bodies are even on stage, and that it's not just the actors and that whole thing. Anyway, yeah, so all the bodies, the pickpockets and the playwrights and all of that. But then I also get into kind of the invisible bodies behind that. So Natasha Corder's done some really lovely work around this, of the invisible labour going on around making theatre happen, but also just about, making people's clothes happen, or making those clothes clean, or whatever it is. And for me, that's part of my conversation with Mol Frith, is finding those kind of material connections. So I found her will in the National Archives last year, and that was a really massive moment, partly because it was supposed to be lost. It wasn't. It was just filed under F for Frith instead of M for Markham, which was her married name, that she only really used to get herself out of legal trouble. But the idea that I was holding this piece of paper that she'd held 360 years, or pretty much exactly to the day, actually, when I found it, just by fortuitous, uncanny coincidence, that we had this connection. We have a material connection. We've both been in contact with the same material, and that felt really important. And I think out of that is this idea that part of the conversation, if there's someone that you don't have lots of facts or data around, you can have a kind of conversation through your body with them by experiencing some of the same materials. So I've been doing things like making oat gall ink and learning how to cut quill pens, and trying to put some things in my life that are like a material connection, things that she would have been familiar with, so that we have an embodied understanding of the same materials. And that's kind of part of the research for me.
Wow. Okay. So there was lots there, and I love this idea of thinking with the body. And I guess that a lot of the texts that you've been referring to are themselves texts which are sort of clamping down on particular moments of the body's life, whether that be baptism or marriage or death, which in various different ways are quite formative moments in the life of any particular body. I love the idea of restoring the text to a collaborative bodily world, and perhaps restoring it in a way where the text is not especially central to the kinds of things you're doing. You've mentioned some great scholars for people to look to there, and I'd add Kirsty Sedgman as well, as someone who's thinking about kind of more recent way in which audiences are kind of expected to behave in the theatre. But can you tell us more about making quills and making your material?
So I have a wonderful friend called Caroline Ross. If you've got any interest in doing any of this stuff yourself, I would definitely check out Caroline Ross. She's Found and Ground on Instagram. So all of this I learned from her. These are oat galls here.
Wow.
So
Goodness.
These guys, this is like the oldest way of making ink. We've been making ink with these guys in Europe for a fantastically long time, and they're basically there's a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs in oak trees, and the oak trees have a kind of allergic reaction to that and make these funny little things called oat galls. So you go on lots of long walks around oak trees, and you you spot your oat galls, and when you've got enough, this is enough for a bit of ink, you bash these up into pieces, into kind of powdery pieces, and then you stew it in water for quite a long time overnight. So you know, in them days when you've got your wood fire going on constantly, you just kind of pop it on the fire pretty much overnight, and you let that stew, and after that you have a lovely kind of sepia ink, and then you do this beautiful bit of alchemy, you do this little bit of magic where you get a load of rusty iron, so all the rusty nails and stuff that you can find, a rusty horseshoe that maybe you found on your village street, whatever it is, and you get all your rusty iron and you dump it in the pot with the ink, and the iron oxide reacts to the tannins, I think it is, in the oat galls, and it turns the ink black in about sort of 3 to 5 minutes, and you get really beautiful dark black ink. And then you get some tree resin, like some fruit tree resin, in a bit of water, and you pop that in, and that's the binder. So that's like the glue that sticks the pigment to the parchment or the paper. So that's ink, and that's some that I made last year. So that's how you make your ink. And the smell of the oat galls cooking is really something. It's very strong, very earthy smell that I can't compare really to anything else that we have in our modern world. So that was, you know, one of these things of going, I'm smelling a smell that people haven't smelt for a very long time, but that may well have been very familiar to someone like Mary. You'd have really known when your neighbour was cooking up some ink. And then quill pens. So I've got, again, this is one of these things where you have to kind of go out and do a bit of foraging in the world. So I live by the river, so I get goose and swan flight feathers kind of wash up, or occasionally there's a fox goose incident that results in some feathers. So you need the flight feathers, which are kind of like the first 2 feathers on the wing, because they have the strongest barrel, and you have to cure it. So you can either do that by leaving it by your fire through the winter, or you put some sand in a pot and get it really, really hot, and then dip the feathers in for about 15 seconds, and that goes hard. And then, I mean, if you want, I can make one now. I don't know if I can angle this.
Please, how exciting.
So you've got your cured feather, and then there's a kind of funny skin on it that you have to scrape off. Do a bit of that.
This is like Blue Peter,
isn't it?
I mean, the big thing I'm getting from just the detail you're giving is about the material conditions of writing something down in this period is how much animals are folded into this very, what we think of as a very kind of human process of writing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then when you get into, if you're writing on parchment, obviously that's some hide, that's another animal there, that's and a whole process, and obviously a whole industry in the tanning industry. So there's this massive, it's just absolutely not someone sitting down in blissful solitude at their desk. There's a whole network of labour that goes into this. So I don't know if I can't quite, cool. So then once you've scraped off your kind of cuticle, I think my razor's a little bit blunt. You kind of take the a scoop off the top.
Wow.
And then it's got all this kind of, this is like the capillary.
Okay.
Which you want to get out. There's quite a few different ways of doing this. So if you go and have a look on YouTube, you'll find lots of different people cutting quills in lots of different ways. But it is a skill that I am still in the process of mastering. So trying not to have an incident here.
Yeah, no, don't have an incident, please. Oh my goodness. You've introduced peril into this experiment now.
I have, jeopardy.
No peril, please. So how would the kind of work that you're doing now, how would that impact on your show or your preparation for a show?
It's a slightly funny one to answer, really, because in a way it kind of doesn't really in an immediate and obvious fashion. I think it's, like I say, it's sort of like trying to find different ways to meet the person that you want to have a conversation with, that get away from kind of official records, I suppose.
Yeah. But
So,
also
yeah.
return us to the physical labour which enables those physical records.
I've just made a little split down the middle.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of understanding the world that they lived in, really. I think understanding the experiences that their body had, understanding the different kind of labour that they would have done. And I think what I notice, so that's very roughly it. And then this, I'm sorry, this is the bit that's going to really disappoint everyone. So that idea of the poet there with their lovely big quill feather. Sorry guys, there's just if you're trying to write with this sticking up your nose, it just doesn't work. But also this is specifically evolved to provide wind resistance. That's how flight happens. So if you try writing the entirety of King Lear with one of these, it's going to be really exhausting. So so you cut it off.
Wow.
Yeah, and then you strip off the barbs. And then that's basically your quill pen. So here's one I made earlier that's like slightly nicer cut, and that works. Yeah, so I think what I'd say, like, having done this, having made quill pens and written with them, is kind of, there's the physical experience of doing that and of getting used to how to cut it, and what a kind of knack that is, as you've just seen from my very clumsy attempt. That has to become something. If you're going to be a great writer, if you're going to be writing all day every day, that's got to be a process that you're so familiar with that you can do it really quickly and efficiently. So that's like a little kind of bit of embodied knowledge, I guess, that we just don't have, but that someone who's writing all day will have. But what I also notice writing with these is that because you have to re-dip a lot, but then you also have to recut, so the nib will wear down as you're writing with it, and that does a particular thing, I find, to my train of thought and to how I write. So if I'm writing on a computer or with a ballpoint pen now, it's very easy to delete, to cut and paste. You can have a very long thought in an uninterrupted way. Whereas if you're writing with a quill pen, you just can't, because you have to keep pausing, whether that's a short pause to dip or a longer pause to recut. And what I notice is that having dipped it, it will write you about the length of the line of, say, a sonnet, and that's
wow.
And that, the point where you have to recut your quill is kind of the end of the sonnet. Do you know what I mean? So you kind of go, well, there's more going on. It's not just a kind of nice, fun thing of what did early modern people have in their lives, but it's also how did those things affect how they thought, how they wrote, and how they made, and the community that you need around you in order to sit down and write something. But also what the materials do to how you think and how you write.
Yes. Yeah. And again, I guess there's a kind of modern equivalent now in that the current situation is driving us all to engage with each other through these funny windows. Hello. Yeah. But at the same time, these funny windows are going to start defining how we think about each other, and the kind of lengths of conversations we can have, and the structure of the conversations we can have will be being determined by that technology. Yes. That's
and
really
I'm pretty sure, when we're all allowed back in rooms together and we're able to make theatre with a live audience, that it is going to have an effect on that as well. And so then, of course, you go, well, they closed the theatres for the plague. So did that, more than once? What did that do when they finally got back in that room? Did it make a difference? Were they just used to it? I don't know. But I'm going to have the hopefully joyful experience of finding out what it's like to go back to making theatre, having not been able to for a while.
Yeah, that'd be really important for your work, won't it? And a question I've found myself thinking about in the current moment is the people who the theatres were being closed for, which I'm putting that in a really bad way, but who were the people who were still going to the theatre at a time of plague outbreak?
Yeah.
Who needed to see the Roaring Girl so urgently that they were prepared to go to a place where plague was particularly likely to be present, because you're amongst 1,000 people, as opposed to 100 people on a street where everyone's moving. You're all together with a massive audience. I've been thinking more and more about what that feels like as a bodily choice,
Yeah.
as a place to put
And
your body.
then, you know, in Mary Frith's life, there's also the moment through the Interregnum where plays are not supposed to be happening, but they are anyway. And you can't. So you go, what? So what was that experience? Was it like a speakeasy, or you know, how was that? How were people putting on performance at that point? And what was it like to encounter that? And was it worth it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's right to kind of towards the end of our conversation now, just head back to Frith a bit, and I guess one thing I feel maybe we should let the audience know is just how, certainly for me anyway, feel free to come back to me on this, but how extraordinary it is to have this ordinary in some ways person. Ordinary is the wrong word, isn't it? But you know, someone who is not elite, is not cis male, be represented in a play in the early 1610s, when plays are things which tell you stories about Alexander the Great or Jesus Christ, or well, basically very dead people. And to go back to your phrase earlier, lots of dead dudes on horses, right? Yeah, and the Roaring Girl as a title, Roaring Boy is kind of a phrase of the time, and it means a boy who is being obnoxiously loud in public places and disturbing the peace, I guess, is sort of what that phrase means. So to then ascribe that to what the play is calling a girl is you know, the term is already one about infringing social norms, and is then imported onto female identity. Yeah. Is your interest in Frith guided by the fact that this is someone doing something utterly extraordinary? Is that what pulls you towards them?
Yeah, I think it's back to that kind of trickster troublemaker thing, really. And I think there's also this interesting thing in terms of, so there's the Roaring Girl, which happened at the Fortune Theatre, which was, I think, a little bit of a notorious playhouse for boisterous jigs, and you know, it was a big, busy public playhouse, and Frith comes off very, very well in the Roaring Girl. She's quite a hero in it, and at almost exactly the same time, and this thing I'm sort of digging around a little bit with at the moment, there seems to be a bit of confusion about what actually happened here, but almost exactly the same time, at either the Blackfriars or the Whitefriars, what looks like the same playing company did a play called Amends for Ladies by Nathan Field, where Moll makes this very kind of peculiar cameo appearance. There's one scene where she turns up in a shop, tries to flirt with the shopkeeper's wife, and leaves, and has no bearing on the plot or anything. But the way it's written, clearly the moment that she walks into that scene, everyone watching it knows who she is, and she doesn't come off so well in that. She gets a strip torn off her by the shopkeeper's wife and leaves, and that's it. So you kind of go, well, there's the Fortune Playhouse audience's relationship with her, and there's this other relationship with her, and so you start to get this sense that there's like a bunch of people for whom she's like one of the lads and a great laugh, and that the Fortune crowd are really into her and enjoy her presence, and then there's another crowd of people who think she's a bit disreputable and, you know, should be severely reprimanded and made to stop. So yeah, you get a kind of sense of the different I guess communities in London at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like, for me, she's this kind of really fascinating prism, that because she problematizes a bunch of stuff around gender and status and class and labour and all sorts of things like that. If you kind of look at her lifetime, look at those kind of 8 decades of London through the sort of prism of her life, you find you're kind of starting to unlock a whole load of other relationships and contexts and stuff within that.
Yeah, and to add to your list of things she troubles, I guess performance as well is something that she troubles, and that she's constantly performing in the archive, not just when she's anywhere near a theatre. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, she has to do penance at St Paul's at one point, and there's someone writes a letter having seen it and says she upstaged the priest, and people stuck around because she was so entertaining whilst doing her penance. And I just love that. I love the echo of this person and having this conversation with her.
Yeah. the scene in Amends for Ladies you mentioned, where you've got what feels like fairly explicitly queer flirtation with the female shopkeeper, I guess, again, just for people who are new to this material, that will be a scene being played by two boys who are being read as cis male. So there's kind of double queerness going on there then in terms of character and performer, just to underline that. Sarah, it's been so much fun talking to you. Of all the glorious and surprising things you've told us, I didn't expect redip to be amongst them. That's my new favourite word. I'm going to be using that wherever I go. We are ending these conversations by asking people what the word literature means to them, whether it's a word they find useful or unhelpful in either their personal or their professional world. Would you mind telling us a little bit about what that word means to you?
Yeah, I guess for me it sort of comes back to that thing of I can't take the literature on its own. For me, if you say literature, I'm like, well, by whom, for whom, with what? So yeah, I think so much around the way that I'm trying to understand Mary Frith is trying to move away from the kind of official air quotes literature of playtext or archive records, and to kind of really dig down beyond those things to find out what the contexts were that made how did that literature come to be, why do we have it, who is it for? And yeah, it's kind of it's a word that sits on top of a whole series of other questions that I'm trying to answer one way or another.
Yeah, great, thank you very, very much. I don't know what we're going to do about the tech issues we had during this film, but we're going to leave them in for now, and I'm going to try and get this video posted ASAP so that we can all celebrate across the globe Thrift Day. Is that what we should call it? Thrift Day?
Yeah, could do.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a really fun conversation. Cheers.
You're welcome.